Goodbye, Broadway, hello, France. We're 10 million strong. Goodbye, sweethearts, wives, and mothers. It won't take us long. Don't you worry while we're there. It's for you we're fighting through. So goodbye, Broadway, hello, France. We're going to swear our debt to you.
Samuel Miller Keplinger, Jr. was born on December 7th, 1894 in Franklin, Pennsylvania, to Samuel Miller Keplinger, Sr. and Rachel Anna Mitchell Keplinger. SMK Jr.'s nickname was Kep. He had three older brothers, Robert Lyman, Walter Franklin, and Raymond Gray. Walter Franklin served in the cavalry during the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century. Kep graduated from high school in Franklin in 1914 at the age of 19. He had worked with his father at the Atlantic Refinery Company, that was oil, where his father was a master machinist. In 1917, SMK Jr. was working for J. Howard Smiley at the local stock brokerage, where he had access to books and did stock price posting on the large board. Samuel Miller Keplinger Jr. volunteered for the American Field Service, along with another man from Franklin, Maxwell Max Rose. He was on the ship Touraine on July 6, 1917, and arrived in Bordeaux, France, on July 10, 1917. Samuel Miller Keplinger Jr. had traveled from Bordeaux, France, with Max Rose, to Paris, France, during the first part of July 1917. In Paris, they reported to the Paris office of the American Field Service to obtain their orders for the ambulance section SSU 71. An entry in Samuel's diary stated, "Obtain cars at Noyon, August 1st, 1917. Joined our division, number 158, at Nesle, where we encamped just outside the city for 3 weeks." The 158th was the French Army unit that was on repose, or the rest period. On August 15th, SSU had a football or soccer game with the French and lost to the French 7-0. Samuel wrote, "Cantonment reached about August 29th, 1917. Situated at Lanchy, 10 kilometers north of Ham and a little further southeast of Péronne. Base hospital was also located at Lanchy. The cars, or ambulance, were Fiats. The residence for SSU-71 were two large tents. On August 27, 1917, Harry Crosby wrote, "You ought to see the inmates of this place, huddled together on their stretchers and vainly endeavoring to keep dry from the rain pouring in. The tent is fairly similar to an ordinary sieve. Water trickles in at every opening, streams through all the openings in small rivulets, dripping through every angle. To keep dry is a task worthy of Mr. Hercules himself." Another story about Crosby and the tent. It rained about 27 of the 31 days in August 1917. One night the tent in which Crosby was sleeping collapsed because the tent stakes pulled out. He slept in the other tent on the ground, cold and wet, wearing everything he owned. Pictures from Samuel's photo album are of the mess hall and the cook's barracks and mechanics field. There were 40 members of SSU-71. The roster that was part of S.M. Keplinger's diary did not correlate the names with the group photograph, but it is certain that these are Samuel Miller Keplinger, called Kep, Max Rose, and Harry Crosby. Using some guesswork and other photographs, another member is Philip Shepley, a friend of Crosby's from Boston, Massachusetts. He is mentioned later in this segment. George Fearing and Stuart Kaiser were also friends of Crosby's from Boston. Lawrence Honig from St. Louis appears with S.M. Keplinger in a few of snapshots from Kep's photograph album. Gas mask drills were useful. The front lines were periodically hit with artillery shells that were called gassers. Samuel wrote, "Front post, Massemy, Marteville, Attilly, and Holden." The night post was at Attilly. They were all in a general easterly direction from Launchy. Samuel wrote, "The abri, or the underground dugout, at Massemy was 12 feet. At Holden, 60 feet. None at Marteville." Holden was 4.5 kilometers from Saint-Quentin in German hands. Keplinger wrote, "Evacuation hospitals, about 6 in Ham, 1 in Cougny, Guiscard, occasional trips to Noyon, points evacuated from Falvy, Quiviers, and Beauvoir." Keplinger described in his diary, "Roads in fine condition, especially state roads between large cities. The road between Ham and Noyon in perfect shape and in a straight line. Roads to post, good because of heavy artillery movements. They are constantly being worked upon." Pictures in Kep's photo album showed roads with camouflage. Several pictures in the albums were of road signs warning against making too much dust that would alert the enemy of their activity and position. The United States Army came to enlist members of the American Field Service. Those not interested in joining the United States Army could decide to go home. Some did, but most stayed with SSU 71. The recruits now were paid $35 per month, considerably more than the French pay. On September 8, 1917, Harry Crosby wrote about finagling a ride in a French two-seater bomber plane. The picture shown here is of a French ace fighter pilot, Gunmeyer, who had over 70 planes to his credit before he himself was shot down. On October 11, 1917, Crosby and Phil Shepley decided to see what trench life was like and bribed a French soldier to guide them to the front. He wrote, "So the three started off. The way led past rows and rows of a breeze, all with high banks of sandbags as covering, with clever camouflage on all sides. After 200 or 300 yards, we crossed a field that was pockmarked with Boche shell holes that were fresh from the day before. Then we went by batteries of 75s, so camouflaged that you wouldn't know they were there. Then we entered a boyau. All of these are named like streets in a city, which we followed, winding in and out to prevent enfilading for a distance of at least 3 miles. You walk along trestle boards, walks, and in the mud. The mud is more terrible than you can possibly imagine. One long line of slime, getting deeper and deeper as you get nearer the front line until it reaches your knees. Innumerable men are kept continually at work cleaning out these trenches. We emerged in a spot that once was a village, but now is a heap of bricks. Here everything lived underground. Trenches, a breeze, and ordinary caves formed the homes of these men who day in and day out risk their lives and undergo untold hardships to save their country from the wrath of the Hun. Another liaison man took us up to the Poste d'écoute, wading in mud all the way. The trench zigzagged in and out, up and down hills, past machine gun emplacement and saps for trench mortars. The trench sides were banked up so we could see only a strip of blue sky. Now and then patches of barbed wire that stretches without a break from the coast to Switzerland along the western front. The guide beckoned us to be quiet. We were approaching the listening post. All along the sides of the trenches were small shelves delved into the sides, containing hand grenades of all descriptions to be used in case of emergency. We were now 40 yards from the Boche listening post. Only a line of barbed wire separated us from them. Dumb as we were, we each took a peek over the real no-man's land. The men at the listening post were on alert night and day, listening for surprise attacks. All around were vast holes made by Fritz's mine woofers, a very deadly trench mortar shell. From the photograph album of Samuel Keplinger are pictures of another method of bringing in the wounded. A couple of methods of transportation at the front, and a supply train. Here's mail call for SSU 71. It's the officer in charge, Lieutenant Spears, and a clerk at the office. Phil Shepley and Tugger Fay, friends of Harry Crosby from the Boston area. Samuel labeled this photo of he and Tugger Fay. It is believed it's actually Lawrence Honig. Here's a picture of Harry Crosby and a very short haircut. This picture of some French poilus on the march. And German prisoners. And these are German laborers. Here's the ruins of the beautiful village of Holnen. This is how the Boche left a beautiful chateau in Ham. And a picture of a bombed house in Ham. This is a destroyed church in Kiviers. All but the Christ. The church was near Ham. A few tales concerning a few members of SSU 71. Number 1, Aviator Anspach, is called Aviator for the simple reason he tried to be one. He, accompanied by Brick, who also retained the name for a while, deserted our camp at Nesle and traveled as British officers, went to Paris for the aviation examination. Both were turned down. 3 weeks after arriving at the front, Number 1 disappeared. He was kicked out. Brick stayed with us, however. Brick, Arthur Brickley, was assigned to the U.S. Army Section 644 after signing up with the U.S. Army. He later was awarded the French Croix de Guerre. He eventually died in France of pneumonia after the armistice was signed. Another tale, the fate of a tank. A British tank started across no man's land. It was not the first attempt, so the Boche was ready for it. The trenches had been widened to such an extent that it was impossible for the tank to span them. It went headfirst into the first trench and stuck there at the mercy of the machine guns and light artillery. It was riddled with bullets and later was burned. Gasoline tank caught fire and the men in it were horribly mutilated. But now the British are lengthening the Caterpillar track so wide trenches won't stop them. This is a tale of the treatment of a Boche aviator prisoner. A Boche observation plane was brought down near Holden. It lit at a spot in full view of Saint-Quentin. I evacuated the observer. The pilot was killed. His instruments and maps were intact. He was badly wounded in the spine, so couldn't walk. First we took him to be interrogated. There he was brutally used. The interrogator yelled to him to get up and walk. It was impossible. Then the guard who had ridden down with us roughly threw him over his shoulders and carried him in the room and dropped him on the floor. The door was shut. But Fearing and I could hear him yell and could distinctly hear them beating him. Evidently, no information was given by the observer, for he was transferred to Noyon. At Noyon, they treated him with care and made him comfortable. He gave them information. He had a map of the German trenches as well as one of the French. I'll never forget the beating he got at Ham. Fearing and I were nearly mobbed because we objected to the rough handling he got from that guard. The guard said if your country had been torn down, women raped, children killed, etc., you would feel the same as I, like cutting his throat. C'est la guerre. On Monday or Tuesday, October 29th or October 30th, 1917, the group went to Paris, on their way to their second combat area, Verdun, via Bar-le-Duc. In Verdun, they picked up a group of Ford Model T ambulances. They were now the U.S. Army Ambulance Section 641. That's the next story. The American Field Service Ambulance Section SSU 71 was now the U.S. Army Ambulance Section 641 after the group signed up with the U.S. Army while in the Somme section north of Paris. The group came to Verdun sector from Ham in the Somme sector on December 3, 1917, and were there until they went on repose on December 8, 1917. They traveled to Verdun sector probably by train from Paris to Bar-le-Duc, and then by truck to the Verdun area. Arriving at the encampment on November 3, 1917, they assumed custody of the Ford Model T ambulances. Samuel Miller Keplinger wrote in his diary, "Headquarters in Poor Barracks at Belle Rupt, 3 kilometers from the city of Verdun, with the 38th, 408th, and 86th Regiments, 120th Division, 13th Army Corps of the 2nd Army, commanded by Divisional Commander General Murdoch. Hospital at Beaulieu, a kilometer southeast of Verdun. Only post, day driving only, at Haudremont, reached by skirting Verdun, just across the canal on the edge of Faubourg Pava, on up through Brosse, then a sharp turn to the right and up through the hills. Another route, a turn to the right a kilometer on the Verdun side of Brosse, going up over the hill, passing not far from Fort Douaumont, and through the absolutely nil city of Fleury. November 3rd, 1917, Harry Crosby wrote home about the trip from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun. This is what he said. "Here we are at Verdun, the most famous place in the history of the world. We came here today in 2 camions, or trucks. It was the most wonderful ride down here that I've ever had. At 9 a.m. we pulled out of Bar-le-Duc. After about 20 kilometers we began to see what real modern warfare behind the lines is. As far as I could see was a long line of huge camions, troops on the march, huge 280 cannons, ammunition trains, revitlement wagons, kitchen carts, and racy staff cars. Way back for miles and miles, this seemingly endless column stretched until it dwindled completely out of sight on the horizon. To the right of our road, 5 railroad lines packed with cars of every type, from the ordinary freight car to gigantic naval guns. Beyond these tracks was a large canal, tightly jammed with enormous, clumsy-looking canal boats. Beyond this, the Meuse River. Aviation hangars, vast motor parks, artillery barracks, dugouts, every conceivable shelter. Everything was camouflaged, from tiny staff cars to the huge caterpillar-wheeled motor tractors dragging immense cannon. There is more traffic here than in the busy sections of downtown New York. Everybody is rushing to and fro. Mud-bespattered dispatch riders, tearing staff cars, rattling artillery trains rush along these roads. This is war, all right. I've never been so impressed in all my life. The tremendous scale on which things are carried out is beyond all conception. The scenery is marvelous. Winding columns of men clad in their blue coats, weighted down with their heavy knapsacks, Rifles slung over their shoulders were crowding every passage towards Verdun. Camions, heavily loaded, crept through the mud. We passed several dead horses lying in grotesque poses in the fields. Cultivation goes on to right up behind the trenches. Most of the houses are standing, as Boches never got past Verdun. We are stationed in huge wooden barrack, about 3 miles out of Verdun itself. We live 20 kilometers back of the lines. As they say, the shelling is terrific. 8 cars, Fords, go out at a time. The abri at the post is electric lighted and steam heated. It was left by the Germans when they recently retreated in last September's attack. Enormous .280 cannon fire right over our heads along the road. There isn't a square yard that isn't pockmarked with shell craters. The mud here is thick, to say the least. We splatter through it in these dinky little flivvers at a great rate. Horses, many vehicles, are all coated inches deep in the slimy stuff. Samuel Miller Keplinger wrote in his diary, 8 cars on duty each day, 4 at hospital and 4 at post. When one came from post to the hospital, another took its place. A very dangerous post in that the Verdun sector has been purely an artillery scrap since the push in 1916. We were right in the midst of the French artillery, which was constantly being shelled. The mud is the only thing that saves our lives. The cars, at one time or another, were covered with mud, plastered with it from a shell landing within a few feet of the car. 5 cars were put out of commission by shells, 3 entirely demolished. 1 car was blown to pieces, hit in the rear, and the driver, Harry Crosby, who was in it at the time, was not even scratched. A fellow, Spud Spaulding, was hit by eclat from the same shell and was sent to hospital, getting another eclat wound from shrapnel on the ride to the hospital. Both wounds in the chest, and fully recovered. In a letter to home dated November 23, 1917, Harry Crosby wrote of the event. It was our turn at the Poste des Secours. Throughout the morning the Boches were sending over shell after shell of shrapnel, so that it wasn't exactly fun driving. Toward 5 p.m. they started shelling both our roads to the post. It turned out that Whedon and Paul in one car and yours truly alone on 741 started to go up. Here's where the trouble started. We covered the first 3/4 of the journey okay. Then as we tore over the dangerous stretch, the big shells started to come in one after the other right by the road, sending up everything in big geysers. Talk about being petrified. We all nearly passed out. There wasn't a sign of a soul stirring anywhere, as all the Frenchmen had taken to a breeze. Dead horses, overturned wagons, and debris of every sort lay strewn over the road. Suddenly, a whiz-bang and a vast heavy hit the side of the road, hardly 40 yards away. Bang, and another monster streamed in and burst with a terrific explosion. Then came 2 more, right on our other side. The eclats were shining, and you could hear the shells screeching in. I nearly passed out completely. We managed to reach the post. I started to turn my car around and had just stalled it in front of Spud's car. Ben Whedon and Paul were right back of me, while Spud was standing in the door of the abri laughing at my stalling my bus. When a shell burst not 10 yards away on top of a little stone ridge, I instinctively shot down to the floor of the car, which saved my young life. There was a deafening explosion, and then flying rocks, eclats, mud, everything in sight shot past us. Spud was hit and knocked down. His car was shot to H. My car, with yours truly in it, was peppered with everything and was a mere mass of wreckage. The whole top caved in, and gaping holes in its side. He, Spud, was hit just above the heart by a piece of eclat, but luckily, through the grace of our Lord, it wasn't very serious, although not a very slight wound. Ben and I volunteered to take him down over the road in Phil's car, which had just arrived and had escaped, mine and Spud's being out of commission. They waited a while for the fire to slow down a bit and for Spud to recover a little, and then they shoved him in the Ford, and off we went. We also had 2 other wounded with us. They were shelling the road, and it was very unpleasant. We had to wait for a truck which was jammed in the middle of the road. I'll never forget that wait. Short though it was bad enough going, but when they're not moving, it's Helvita. We got about 1/3 the way down, the French guns blazing away at tremendous pace, and a few arrivees coming in when Spud got it again, the eclat passing through the brass nameplate on the car. I never thought the flivver would make the steep grade, but she just did. I was out pushing her. It must have been a ludicrous sight. The last entry in Samuel's diary about Verdun saw wonderful displays of the famous artillery drum fire, kept going for 48 hours. At night the whole sky along the front was lit up similar to a large fire. A note here, December 7th, 1917 was Samuel Miller Keplinger's 23rd birthday. The group went on repose, or rest period, on December 8th, 1917, to Andernay. Samuel wrote in his diary, went on repose December 8th, 1917, to Andernay, near Rivigny, which is near Bar-le-Duc. Was there 19 days, the coldest weather we had in France, 0 weather, and we had to wash our cars. Slept in a cold, bug-infested hayloft. A letter from Harry Crosby on December 10th, 1917, to home. He wrote, "Here we are, in repose, way back of the lines and out of sound of the guns. It is really bully not being at the front, for we have been there since the middle of last August, and we're getting rather tired. The section is billeted at Andernay, a tiny typical French village composed of 2 rows of squat stone houses on either side of the road, which runs down through it. A few of us are quartered up in a barn loft above a basse cour, full of chickens, rabbits, bovines, and a huge hog. The first night the whole bunch, including the Frenchman, slept in this loft, and what a night! I shall never forget it. We all lay fully dressed, hats and boots on, in the lousy straw, in a long row with our heads up against a brick wall. The place is pretty small, so there wasn't an inch to spare between anyone. A sketch from St. Louis by name of Honig, a confirmed snorer, was going at top speed all night. Others were coughing, and all of us scratching. The cooties abounded. I collected several families of them. It was rather frigid. A scout named Conant and I slept under a couple of blankets and a heap of straw. Needless to say, cootie infested. One fellow, no names mentioned, had a violent attack of mal de mer at 1 a.m., which added to the confusion. The only means of approach to this loft is a ladder coming up through a small opening. The great beams and rafters, together with the slanting roof, are covered with dusty cobwebs. The whole atmosphere of this charming locality is rustic, damn rustic. There is a vast bovine right under where we sleep, which moves and groans most of the time. Of course, there's farmyard rooster, which crows at 4 a.m. The place is littered with rabbits and chickens. The owner of this barn is one of those typical French women. She wears a little white bonnet and is very kindly. She says she fancies les Américains. She's a little wizened up old Jane, but very nice. The other inhabitant is hubby, aged anywhere from 20 or 80. A regiment from our division is quartered here, and we see them up at the little cafe at the end of the street, where we all sit around on a long board table sipping beer or eating rabbit. The place is packed full of poilus and thick with smoke. We eat in camp, out in plein air. This outdoor life is certainly ideal and is very healthy. From our left we can look over the chicken coop at the stone church with a clock tower and a bell that rings hours and half hours. At night, not a sound. The weather is fine, cool and crisp, with plenty of sunshine. Pictures from Samuel's photo album. There is no other description other than the captions written under the pictures. School children in Andernay. The town crier. Helping the farmers. Francais and Toto. Dick English, mechanic. Jack King, sergeant. Samuel wrote, left for Clermont in Oregon the 27th December. Went on permission to Rouen, France, the 29th of December, 1917. The group left Andernay for Clermont in Oregon. Then from Clermont to St. Menehould by truck or ambulance, to board a train for Paris via Chalons. Samuel wrote in more detail in his 1918 diary, although the descriptions for the day's events were brief and sketchy. Some days there was no entries at all. On January 1st, 1918, he writes, my third day of my first and only permission in 6 months. staying at the Mirabeau Hotel on Rue de la Paix, paying 12.5 francs per day for a room with bath. Wrote letter in the evening, an unheard of thing in Paris. Max out having a good time, probably with Fim. Wonderful service here. On the 2nd of January, he wrote, got ordre du moment for Rouen. Dined with Mr. and Mrs. Charles Hetzel, the Galena Signal Oil Company representative in France. It supplies oil to French railroads. A fine couple. Treated me like a king. Have a fine apartment. Weighs 70 kilos, 154 pounds, in uniform. Weather rather cold the last 4 days. On the 3rd of January, moved from Mirabeau to YMCA, the old hotel pavilion on Rue des Exchequers. Too expensive at Mirabeau, 13 francs a day for room. Wrote Sonny. 1 month ago today, I had my last trip to Haudremont. Very active. Arrived in Rouen with Max. Visited Mr. and Mrs. Redenbach in Le Chalet in Bois-Guillaume. Wonderful home. Had a fine room, foot warmers, and pancakes. Went to English Base Hospital, number 9, with Mrs. Redenbach. Saw and talked with Dr. Thompson. Great to see home folks again. Saw Preach Ware of Rocky Grove there also. Americans showing up English in many cases at hospital. On the 5th, he wrote, dined with Lieutenant Thompson and Max. Max wore French officer's uniform. I wore field service, English officers. Defendu for officers to eat with privates, but no one knew us as privates. Walked through Rouen with Lieutenant. Had tea with him. Sneaked in our own biscuits. Max left to see Ware at the hospital. Wonderful cathedrals, wonderful. Mr. Rettenbach arrived home. American Vice Consul at Rouen, making soap on a small scale. Deals in oil. Very excellent, good-looking gentleman. January 6th, 1918. Mrs. Rettenbach gave a Sunday dinner party. Max and I, Lieutenant Thompson, Ralph Ware, Mr. Benson, the American consul in Rouen. Very homey gathering. Rettenbachs live in Bois-Guillaume, a suburb of Rouen. January 7th, lunched in Rouen with Dr. Thompson and Max. Spent afternoon with Dr. and Preach Ware at the hospital. In the evening, went to the movies with Mr. and Mrs. R. Saw Douglas Fairbanks and Bessie Lore in a Western play. A month ago, went on repose to Andernay, near Rivigny, after 5 horrible weeks at Haudremont in the Verdun section. On the 8th of January, bade farewell to host and hostess and left for Paris on Le Havre Paris Express. Arrived in Paris at 2 p.m. A 3.5-hour run. Put up at YMCA. Went to Casino de Paris featuring Gabby Delis for the 3rd time. Good show with good American jazz band, and the crowd goes wild when it plays. The French don't know just what to make of it, but can be seen swaying and keeping time. Next, Clermont in Oregon.